Buongiorno a tutti.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. And you're not so numerous, but you're numerous enough to listen to a meeting which will focus on some fundamental issues. And we will talk about these issues together with Mariana Mazzucato. Well, Mariana Mazzucato, just a few words to introduce her, and then she will make her speech, and then we will have the opportunity to make some questions. So Mariana Mazzucato teaches economy of innovation at UCL, where she is at the head of the Institute for Public Purpose, and she's an expert in the relationship between public and private, and she is a counselor for many governments, and she has focused a lot about this issue, the issue of the presence of the state and its relationship with the economy, with the market. In this past few years, after the financial disaster of 2008, we have realized that the state can be a problem solver, a facilitator, something, an engine or an infrastructure which can help the market re-emerge and come back. So a state that now should not interfere with the strategies and with the missions. And I use this word on purpose because in her book, Mission Economy, A Guide to Change Capitalism, mission is not a neutral word. It's not just a word taken from our common language. It makes reference to the ability to plan in the long term and implement things in the long term in order to reach objectives which should also be long-term. Mission, as Mariana Mazzucato uses it in her book, is a word which is in contrast with the disease of our times, which is short-termism. That is the obsession of short-termism, which affects politics, but also the economy. And think of, for example, investors who very often just look at the short term and not at the long term. Now, in order to correct all these problems and modify this idea that comes from the 80s, from the Thatcher and Reagan times, well, for some years now, there has been a debate about this, and Mariana Mazzucato had already published a book with La Terza on this new relationship between public and private sector. So this book is not just a book about the economy. It's called Mission Economy, but it's a guide also to change the political life, to change politics, so that politics takes back its role, that is the role of defining the objectives for the whole community. So welcome Mariana Mazzucato. At the end of her lecture, it will be possible to make questions. Mariana speaks perfect Italian, but she will speak in English. So when you make questions, we will not have to wait for the time of translation. Mariana Mazzucato.
Grazie, grazie Pietro, e se qualcuno mi può solo dare il segnale che mi vedete, perché io vedo solo i miei slides. Pietro magari torna, dimmi solo se posso andare avanti, perché dicevi che non mi vedevi. Ci vediamo? Mi vedi? No? Tutto a posto, fantastico, ok. Allora, prima di tutto grazie a tutti, e soprattutto al festival, anche a te. No, non mi vedete. Adesso ti sento. Fantastico, allora, ok, fantastico. Allora, dico solo due parole in italiano che stavo dicendo grazie a tutti, ma soprattutto scusate se parlo in inglese, ma come ho già detto un'altra volta, mi sembra anche al Festival di Trento, che niente, sono nati in Italia, ma poi siamo andati via prestissimo. Avevo 4 anni, quindi non mi sento, diciamo, di fare questa lezione in italiano. E le poche volte che ho cercato di fare lezioni in italiano ho fatto un po' di guai, tipo mi sembra che una volta ho detto quando questo variabile supera una certa soglia succede qualcosa e un studente ha detto ma scusi professoressa cosa succede quando invece passa il merluzzo? E quindi niente, da quel momento ho detto solo inglese, però di sicuro ovviamente nel Q&A facciamo tutto in italiano. Allora, niente, cominciamo. Il libro l'ho scritto perché secondo me... Ah no, devo parlare in inglese. I wrote the book... Beh, anzi, facciamo un misto. Il libro l'ho scritto perché bisogna andare oltre il dibattito che lo Stato è tornato, lo Stato è grosso, lo Stato fa...
My focus on the fact that we should go beyond
ideology. We need to go beyond the dichotomy, state versus market. And in fact, we need to unpick the words. What kind of state? And the market itself, the word the market is often confused with business. And I'm going to try to not do that. I will speak about business and the state and markets as outcomes of how we organize public institutions, how we organize private institutions, of which there's many, many problems. In fact, many large corporates are talking about the problems within the private sector.
È proprio caduto il collegamento adesso.
Also, the interrelationship between public, private, but also the other actors in the economy, which include civil society, organizations like trade unions, all these different governance issues and interrelationships, we could call it ecosystem issues, determine the kind of market we get, determine the kind of economy we get. So let's just forget the word market versus state. Let's talk about the granularity of what kind of state, what kind of business, and what kind of interrelationship we actually need between public and private. And I won't talk much about civil society institutions, but let's all just remember that without trade unions, we wouldn't have the weekend. We wouldn't have the 8-hour workday. We would still have children working in factories. So, you know, the labor movement and labor unions got us the kind of civilized, as opposed to barbaric economy. In some cases, we still have a barbaric economy. Anyway, has helped to shape the economy we have today. So really what we're talking about is market shaping, market creating. And what can we learn from, and that'll be the key part of my lecture, what can we learn from what happened 51 years ago when humans actually managed to get to the moon and back, because that was the mission. It was not just to go to the moon, and back. What did it actually mean for intra-organizational governance? What did it mean for inter-organizational relationships? And believe me, I know, like everyone knows, that the social challenges we have today are so much harder in some ways than getting to the moon, because they are deeply social, political, behavioral challenges. But given that we still have this ideology that the state is not able, the state cannot invest, at best the state can set the rules of the game, fix market failures, then please get the hell out of the way. Actually, it is important to even look at the moon landing and ask, what did it mean to be purpose-driven? What did it mean to have metrics that were actually based on objectives, right? And to allow all the dynamic spillovers to happen along the way. What did it mean to take seriously the partnership with business as opposed to just talk about being business friendly or commercialization opportunities? So these are the issues I want to draw out. And also, of course, step back and say that the challenges we have that are, you know, beneath the Sustainable Development Goals are much, much harder than getting to the moon. They are so-called wicked challenges requiring all sorts of other changes, not just technological and organizational. So, you know, this lecture is, of course, happening in the midst of the COVID-19 moment, and that's why, unfortunately, I'm speaking to you on video, because had I come to Trento, which I love, I would have had to quarantine 10 days when I returned, and I have 4 children and a complex life, as we all do, and I would not have been able to quarantine 10 days. Anyway, so this lecture is happening in the midst of this moment where we have globally realized how unprepared we are, right? We were not able globally during the first phase of COVID-19 to deliver even the basic things like personal protection equipment to frontline workers, who we've called essential workers, but we continue in many countries of the world not to value these essential workers. We don't pay them the proper wage. We don't properly fund our global health systems. Had this pandemic actually begun in Africa, not in China, we would all be globally worse off, right? It's a pandemic. By definition, we have to go at it together. And, you know, health systems in many parts of the world, including in many African countries, continue to be extremely weak, but also many developed economies. I live in the UK, where we've unfortunately been experiencing cuts to our public health system, to the point that just 6 months before COVID-19 hit, the doctors were all on strike. Junior doctors and junior nurses were on strike because they were not, well, they felt they were not working within a system that was being valued, right? And then during COVID-19, we sit on our steps and we clap essential workers, but this is a wake-up moment. Are we actually valuing these very systems we realize are absolutely critical? But we also woke up to the fact that we had a huge digital divide. I have 4 children, and they, during lockdown, continued to have access to their human right to education, one of the Sustainable Development Goals. But so many children, again, in both developed and developing countries, did not, given the lack of broadband connection, the lack of different types of digital technologies in their households where they were locked down. The test and trace system failed in so many different parts of the world. I live in the UK, where we managed to outsource the test and trace system to Deloitte, one of the consulting companies that has been actually benefiting in many ways from all sorts of different crises, not because it's their fault, but because state capacity is so weak that it ends up outsourcing its brain to different types of private companies, with which it should be, of course, partnering, but you don't outsource your brain. You can outsource certain things, but not the fundamental things that are required to actually govern an economy and govern a crisis. And the vaccine, again, very ill prepared. It's not enough to have a vaccine, and we do have a vaccine, different vaccines. There's 6 different variations out there because of enormous public and private investments. Over $12 billion have been spent by governments. Many billions have been spent by the private sector. But it's a health pandemic. What's the point of having a vaccine if 80% of the world doesn't get vaccinated? It doesn't make any sense. So both in terms of the solidarity that's required, but also in terms of how we govern innovation, right? We shouldn't forget that growth and innovation have not just a rate, but a direction. How we govern growth, how we govern innovation matters. And so the fact we still have intellectual property rights being, in some ways, let me just be really frank, abused, becoming instruments for rent seeking as opposed to value creation. Patents are often too wide, too strong, too upstream, too long. You know, we actually right now need a patent pool, or in some cases, a patent waiver. Patents are brevetti in Italian. And that would allow us to have at this moment right now, collective intelligence, right? Which is what we need. We need to be sharing our understanding, sharing our knowledge, not just of the vaccine, but all the different tools and therapies that are required at the moment. We don't have that. So big summary of my first slide, and I promise to go quicker, is we're not prepared. We're not prepared for crises. We're not prepared for pandemics. And it has to be a wake-up moment. And of course, this crisis happened on the back of other crises, the climate crisis, the financial crisis, and so on. And for the climate crisis as well, we have not been prepared. We needed a 16-year-old from Sweden, Greta Thunberg, who's done us all a great service to kind of slap us in the face and say, what do you do when your house is on fire? Do you sit there and debate? Should I go out? Should I stay in? What do I need? What? No, you get out. And we're not getting out of the climate crisis at the speed that the scientists are telling us, that the IPCC report told us in 2019, when we were globally told, you got 10 years left, what are you going to do? So, you know, since then, we continue to subsidized too much fossil fuel companies. We, even during the COVID-19 recovery funds, allowed them to be allocated to energy companies that have been too much still focused on fossil fuel projects. And you'll know from last week, or was it the week before, that Exxon has just gone through a big revamp of its board after the climate activists took over at least 2 seats on the board because of that lack of movement that we actually are currently seeing. So we are not moving fast enough. And one of the things I have been arguing for a very long time in the books that Pietro was kindly citing, in both The Entrepreneurial State, Lo Stato Innovatore, The Value of Everything, Il Valore di Tutto, and the recent book, is that we have the wrong kind of policy. We have the wrong kind of private sector as well, by the way, and I'm not going to talk too much about that given the time, but my previous book was all about that. We have a private sector that is too short-termist, is too financialized. Over $4 trillion have been spent in the last 10 years by the S&P 500 companies just in buying back their shares to boost stock prices, stock options, and executive pay. And that requires a whole change in corporate governance. But what I'll argue also during the talk is that that doesn't happen on its own. We need notions of stakeholder governance and purpose to go to the center of the system, to how all the different actors work together to deliver the outcomes we need. But in terms of this slide here, and what I've been arguing in my previous books, is we need a different type of state. It's simply not true that we need more state, or the state is back, and big state, big budgets, big debt, big deficit. We need a fundamentally different type of public actor driven by public purpose, what I will very soon be calling missions, public missions, and actually hold itself accountable to that. And unfortunately, even from the economic theory perspective, we have framed the role of government at best as fixing market failures. At worst, you have Reagan, that's his beautiful picture here, Thatcher saying, please get out of the way. What did Thatcher say? If you find yourself on a public bus, you're a loser. Obviously something's wrong with you, right? So that's like one extreme. But the other extreme is, yes, of course we need the state. It's there to fix problems in the economy. It's there to literally fill a gap by what the private sector doesn't do. Even the concept of the public good, which sounds good, 2 words, one of which is good, is framed in terms of filling the gap of something the private sector is not doing because of positive externalities around things like research and development, clean water, defense systems. These are public goods that the state invests in because the private sector doesn't. Or negative externalities like pollution, state comes in and imposes something like a carbon tax. We don't have it, by the way, so it's still a good thing to do. But what I argue is it's not enough. Different types of other failures like asymmetric information. So small companies are not getting the loans they need. State comes in with SME finance. Now, all these market failures do exist. It is actually quite a useful concept to think about markets, and they fail, and what the state has to do. But the problem is you do not transform a system through bandaging it up. You literally are just bandaging it up. It's a short-term solution. What if you actually want to transform a system? What if you want a greener economy, a more inclusive economy? What if you actually cared about the sustainable development goals that every country from Italy, Uganda, Brazil, United States signed up to in 2015? Can you actually fix your way towards solving those goals? I believe the answer is no. And it doesn't mean you throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's keep that framework. But it also means we need, on top of that, to have a market shaping, a market co-creating perspective of policy. And it's also important to think about what are the tools that you need inside government to do that. And this picture here of Lord Agnew, he's a Tory, so he's a conservative politician in the UK government. He said something so interesting that I've been repeating to myself and to others. He said that what he observed in Brexit and during COVID-19 was that the UK government had outsourced its brain to the big 4 companies, KPMG, McKinsey, Deloitte, and so on, and that this was infantilizing, this is the word I use now, infantilizing the public sector, right? If you're not investing within your own capacity to govern and to partner, governing also means partnering with other actors, including not only business, if you're not investing in your capacity to do so, you become stupid. You actually become dependent on those very fill the gappers entities, and particularly on consultants. And I know in Italy, this has been also in the front pages, where the recovery scheme itself, to some extent, has been outsourced to McKinsey. And so one of the really important things is, if we need a stronger, more dynamic, more agile, more flexible state, what are the capabilities, the capacity we need within state institutions to deliver for citizens that actually vote on the politicians we have? So this is in no way a defense of the state, something that always comes back to me. And I'm like, no, listen, actually read the book. Don't just stop at the title. You know, what is the kind of state we need? What is the kind of capacity, capability, intra-organizational culture, design of the tools from procurement, grants, loans, and so on, that we need in order to actually confront the challenges that we have today, which I always go back to have to be the Sustainable Development Goals around poverty, around hunger, around climate change, around all sorts of different issues, including gender parity. But if we're not investing within that capacity, we have a problem. And so the reason I looked at the Apollo program was not to say that today's challenges are like going to the moon. You know, believe me, it's not that easy. I know that, you know that. But there is something about the questions that NASA asked itself when it set that goal back in 1962. You know, what did it mean to actually welcome experimentation, welcome the difficulty? You know, Kennedy's speech was so clear. He said, we need to go to the moon because it's hard, not because it's easy. I mean, imagine if we spoke like that about climate change. We're going to do it because it's hard. We're going to do it and it's going to cost a huge amount of money, which he said it would cost. He was careful to say less than what we spend on cigars and cigarettes. But it's hard, it's worth it. You know, to be honest, what he was thinking about was beat the Russians, you know, Sputnik, Cold War. But, you know, at the time, that was their kind of wartime military challenge. But he set a very specific goal. He didn't just stop at beat the Russians, right? Today, we can't stop at fight climate change. What does it actually mean on the ground? What is the goal? What is the metric? What is the timeline that we're going to do it in? And if we're not going to do it like that, we're going to, you know, basically not do it. It's not going to be a serious plan. There'll be no investment strategy. There'll be no innovation strategy. And when he gave those famous speeches at Rice Stadium, in Congress, also in front of the Irish Parliament, he was quite clear, and, you know, this also came out in different speeches, not just his own. They had no idea how to go. They really had to experiment. There was different ways to get there and back, and they finally landed on this lunar orbit rendezvous. But this idea that the public sector not only has to be kind of ambitious and do inspirational things, but experiment, learning by doing, trial and error and error and error. And there were many errors. In fact, you'll know that there was a very large error around the Apollo 1 fire, where 3 astronauts lost their lives. And just before dying, Gus Grissom, one of those 3 astronauts in 1967, said, Jesus Christ, you know, how the hell are we going to get to the moon if we can't even talk between 2 or 3 buildings? Because he couldn't hear what was being said to him by the mission control room. And there was, like, you know, different things going on. There was very little actually horizontal communication. And anyone who, you know, speaks to government officials or those who work with them will know that this is a constant critique today, that every department works within its silo. There's no proper joined up thinking. And so what that mission did of getting to the moon and back, and the trial and error and error and error that happened along the way, was create a real kind of recognition within NASA that they themselves needed to change. The public sector, the state, needed to change in order to be purpose-oriented. And so George Mueller, who came in from Bell Labs, a very innovative private sector innovation agency, which, by the way, I'll just say it now because I'll forget to later, came about in an era where the state was much more confident, because Bell Labs came about from the state imposing conditions on AT&T, telecoms company, to reinvest its profits back into the economy in order to maintain its monopoly status. and to reinvest in such a way that actually led to innovation, big innovation beyond telecoms. Bell Labs, very famous all over the world. If you haven't read it, read The Dream Factory. George Mueller came from Bell Labs into NASA and helped NASA change its organization to have project managers who each had a team and would be in constant communication with each other. So that kind of flexible, dynamic, horizontal communication, which is incredibly important with any mission, not just going to the moon. You want government departments to actually be working creatively, dynamically, horizontally together. And the other thing is, NASA, and this is again very important for modern day missions, it was not just aeronautics. It was nutrition, electronics, material innovation, software. The whole software industry in some ways could be seen as a spillover from this particular moon mission. Many different companies, small, medium, and large, took part. And many spillovers happened along the way. The goal was getting to the moon, but because it was organized in that flexible, dynamic way, because there was strong linkages between science and industry, lots of things happened along the way. Camera phones, athletic shoes, home insulation, foil blankets, scratch-resistant lenses. These are just examples of different things that happen along the way. In Lo Stato Innovatore, I talked about how everything that makes our iPhone smart, internet, GPS, touchscreen, Siri, are similarly spillovers from different types of public missions, which allowed the private sector to come in and do great things. So the internet was a solution to a problem that DARPA at the time, back in the day when the ARPANET was first getting invested in, set itself. The problem that DARPA had with the internet that it set itself was, how do we get the satellites to communicate? The internet was an answer to that. GPS was the answer to the Navy's problem of how to know very precisely where all the ships were in the sea. So this purpose-oriented public sector that sets itself problems, at the time, wartime problems, today these should be the SDG kinds of problems, can really foster lots of bottom-up innovation. But not by saying, we need business, bring in business. No, by saying, we need to solve problems, and business come in, help us. So instead of picking winners, deciding already which technology, which sector, which firm, we need to be picking the willing, right? Thinking of what the problems are and then redesigning those tools on the ground to really catalyze as much investment, innovation, experimentation, and trial and error from all the different actors. And also what I found so interesting in the kind of research for the book was reading what the people inside NASA were saying. So, they wanted to partner with business. They knew they had to, but with a purpose, right? So they had a goal, but then they left open the how. But they designed the contracts properly, which I don't think we do today. The Green Deal, listen to the scientists, as Greta says, the deal, that's a social contract. We need to go back to, the kind of legal basis beneath the contracts, which is currently, I think, in many countries, setting us up to fail. In Italy, many of the contracts and the relationships between public and private are not symbiotic. They're not mutualistic. They are often parasitic. It rains down subsidies, guarantees to do what? To stay in place. So what was interesting with NASA is they changed the procurement contracts, gli appalti, to be not cost plus, but fixed price. There was a goal, there was a prize, the fixed price, but then there was constant incentives for innovation and investment. You got extra if you did really well. And they also designed into the contracts no excess profits. In other words, if we're going to do this together, let's not make this a gambling casino, as I would argue space is today, with Elon Musk, who's received $5 billion miliardi dollars from the US government for his 3 companies, but it's on the back of a massive public infrastructure, the International Space Station and so on. And yet it's talked about as, private entrepreneurship, Elon Musk, a genius. I'm sure he is a genius, but it's on the back of a collective ecosystem of private and public. And how do we actually share the rewards given that collective nature? And NASA actually cared about that. I found that fascinating. Another thing I found fascinating was that Ernest Brackett, the head of procurement in NASA, was very aware of the problem that Lord Agnew in that previous slide talked about. He said, if we don't invest in our own brain, in our own capacity, our own capabilities, we will get captured by what he called brochuremanship. Because at the time they didn't have PowerPoints like I have today, or this cartoon has here. They had brochures. Companies would bring in their sexy little brochures and say, oh, we can help you. And he said, we want to work with the top companies, the best companies, not the ones that have the nicest brochures. But if we become stupid, if we stop investing in our own brain, our own capacity, our own capability, we won't even know who to partner with. We won't know how to write the terms of reference. And guess what? I think that's the situation we have today in many public administrations who overly outsource their brain. And so, the key point of the second half of the book is, well, what limits us today? If we're interested in the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which in theory we are, and not because I say we are, but because every country has basically signed up to them, there's 169 targets beneath them, and we are not getting any closer to achieving them. Hence, my early points when I was saying that we are unprepared. And I really believe that one of the ways, it's not the only way, to get serious about them is in fact to apply that kind of moonshot thinking, but not by just making big projects that are, just the pet project of a minister or of a CEO, whether it's Bill Gates or a minister of the environment, but really to have that kind of purpose-oriented approach towards the SDGs that allow us to redesign our policies, whether it's innovation policy, industrial strategy, procurement policy, to bring in as many different actors in the system, public, private, not profit, but especially in the business community, as many different sectors like it took to get to the moon, nutrition, electronics, materials, software, to solve each and one of the different problems we have. But it's not going to happen without a strong government. It's not going to happen without talking about growth as a direction, more inclusive and sustainable growth. The market alone, business alone, does not get us sustainable growth. But so how do you actually have goals, but keeping quite open on the how? How do you redesign those procurements policies like Ernest Brackett did? So on the back of some of this thinking, some years ago, I wrote a report for the European Commission around thinking in this mission-oriented way, specifically at the time for its innovation policy, where I said, stop making these false lists of sectors, technologies, firms like SMEs, small, medium enterprises. Start thinking of the problems you have. Start with the Sustainable Development Goals. So those are the challenges. They're not missions, they're challenges, broad, like beating the Russians was. Turn them into missions as concrete as getting to the moon and back in a generation. Get as many different sectors, so you're not just allowing one sector to benefit in a parasitic way, and redesign those grants, loans, procurement to foster that bottom-up innovation that we require amongst all different organizations, especially, but not only in the business community. So whether it's SDG, sorry, this is reversed here, it should be 13 for clean oceans, it's 13 for climate change, 14 for clean oceans, that's correct. Turning these SDGs into specific targets like a plastic-free ocean, like 100 carbon neutral cities in Europe by 2030, and all the different sectors from chemicals, real estate, energy, mobility, food, design, waste, AI, so on and so forth. But the trick is, stop just handing out money. Stop raining subsidies and guarantees. Put conditionality at the center. Pick those who are willing to work with you towards actually solving these problems, but keep it quite open on the how. And this is, why I helped the UK government, actually under Theresa May, not Boris Johnson, Theresa May's government. I worked closely with Greg Clark and said, what would this look like if the industrial strategy of a country was not just a random list of sectors like steel, clean or energy, automobiles, and so on, but actually looking at the problems we face around clean growth, aging, mobility, and so on. What would it look like to turn these challenges, which then they chose on the back of this relationship we had, into missions like the future of mobility and having, universally accessible travel, creating congestion and emission-free zero accident systems? What would it mean for transport, inclusive design, robotics and AI, and so on. And what would it mean for the way you actually design your industrial strategy to crowd in lots of experimentation, in this case, including in areas like disabilities, if you want 100% accessible travel. In Sweden, what I have found really interesting, and we've been working through my institute with the innovation agency called Vinnova in Sweden, they've set themselves a national mission of a carbon-free, a fossil-free welfare state. And it lands on the structures like public transport, public education, public health. And one of the food missions was in schools. You know, what if school meals, I pasti nella scuola, instead of just having procurement to random organizations that, you know, just get money to deliver food, what if the mission was at the food level, at the school level, to have tasty, sustainable, healthy meals? What if children got involved in designing those very meals, but also had it throughout their curriculum, but that you had also metrics to make sure the school meals were truly sustainable in terms of their entire value chain? This is also something we've been working on in London through the Camden Renewal Commission that I co-chair with the leader of Camden Council, where I live in London, where we're looking at housing estates, again, schools as places, right, place-based strategies where we implement these really strong, inspirational, targeted strategies like carbon neutral housing, but bring citizens who live in the housing to the table to actually co-design and co-create those missions, and then work backwards and say, what does it mean for the budget? What does it mean for procurement? What does it mean for public-private partnerships, and so on? And, you know, for me, these questions are critical for changing how we think of policy, how we think of government, but also how we think of the new relationship we need between business and the state. And, you know, business is in trouble. We have lots of short-termism. We have lots of financialization. But luckily, there's lots of leaders who have been talking about the need for change through the ESG targets, the sustainability targets, the notions of purpose, the notions of stakeholder capitalism. So both Larry Fink and the Business Roundtable, which you see here on the slides, have over the last 2 years talked about the need to replace maximizing shareholder value with stakeholder value. But unfortunately, I don't see much change. And I think that's because at best, it's been a discussion within corporate governance boardrooms. We need to put the notion of purpose and stakeholder value at the center of the system, at the center of how all the different actors work together, also how they're governed, but also how they work together, public-private partnerships that are truly purpose-oriented. And, you know, if we can't do it with the vaccine, if we can't actually govern intellectual property rights at a moment of a health pandemic to be structured in such a way that really fosters collective intelligence, then we're screwed. You know, there's no point of talking about stakeholder value if we can't do it when we actually need it. And I've been writing about this for a long time. This is something that AOC has been recently talking about. We actually met just before she joined the US Congress. We talked about how crazy it was that the US government invests $40 billion a year in drug innovation. 75% of blockbusters actually trace their innovation and the kind of high risk, early stage finance for innovation to these national public institutes of health. And yet the prices of the drugs don't reflect that. The intellectual property rights don't reflect that. So what does it mean to govern a public-private relationship with notions of public value and public purpose at the center so that prices and intellectual property rights reflect that? And I'll just finish. I'm almost done. I was told I have 35 minutes and I'm now speaking 33 minutes, so 2 minutes left. I think it's a great opportunity. I want to end on a positive note. We have a European recovery plan, which in theory is conditional on governments getting their acts together. So it's a public-public conditionality. So with the financial crisis, the conditionality was that governments like Greece, Italy, Spain, you know, Goldman Sachs called us the pigs, PIGS, Portugal, Italy, Greece, Spain, had to cut their budget deficits in order to access the recovery. And that was foolish. We all know austerity did not work. It ironically increased debt to GDP because by having very minimal public deficits, we ended up causing more problems later that we had to pick up and then spend the public budget on. So this time we have a recovery plan that's conditional on governments actually having a plan around digitalization, climate change, and strengthening health systems. So, that's an important moment just to signal. And on the public-private, what's interesting is we're seeing something I haven't seen as explicit before. This is the French finance minister telling Renault and Air France that in order to access the recovery, they had to lower their carbon footprint. Not a bad idea. We had Austria and Denmark telling companies if they wanted to use tax havens, paradisi fiscali, they could not access the recovery fund. It ain't rocket science. We had Elizabeth Warren trying to convince Trump in the CARE Act that we shouldn't be just giving out money to companies that are excessively using share buybacks, extracting value out. So these conversations are being had today, public-public conditionality and public-private. And I really think it's a good moment to rethink the economics. In the book, the last chapter, chapter 6, I look through the implications of what I talk about in the book, of how we think about value, markets, organizations, finance as outcomes focused, distribution, sharing both risks and rewards, truly purpose-driven partnerships, and the co-creation, allowing also an open system and a co-design of the future by really bringing citizen assemblies to the center, but also labor unions and other social movements to the center of this change that's required, which, by the way, requires also a particular capability within the civil service of empathy, which means listening, putting yourself in other people's shoes. It's not sympathy, empathy. And also a whole new vocabulary. This is why I set up the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose at UCL. I really think we need a new vocabulary, a new framing for government policy. It's not about fixing, but co-creating. It's not about de-risking, but welcoming uncertainty. It's not about picking winners, but picking the willing. It's definitely not about leveling the playing field, but tilting it towards a direction of sustainable growth. Very clear, but keeping open the how. You can't outsource your way out of this. And surely we also need better metrics, cost benefit, net present value. If we had used them to go to the moon, we would have never bothered going. Anyway, thank you so much. I'm very keen now to engage Pietro in the audience and any questions you might have.
To stress the last passage when you mentioned the next generation EU and how the different European countries have interpreted their recovery and resilience plan, because that allows us to identify a huge difference versus the rescuing of the economy that happened after the financial crisis of 2008. It is no longer the whatever it takes issue. It is not just measures to rescue. This has to be connected to the two main trends, the ecological transition and the digital transition, which are the very heart and soul of the Europe of the future that will hopefully resurrect from the pandemic. I believe that this is a very important point, and it can give us a reason to be optimistic viewing the present situation. So this is a Q&A part of our meeting. There's a microphone here on my left. Please, if you have a question, come and speak in the microphone. Thank you very much. Don't be shy. There we can see there is already a candidate. Can you hear me? Yes, we can. Which is the relationship, in your opinion, between bias towards the state, towards the role of the state, which unfortunately is a reality, at least in some areas, and the trickle-down economics vision, that is the theory according to which if the rich become richer, the whole society will benefit from this. This is, I believe, an anachronistic vision, which, however, I have the impression is still shared by many. Thank you.
Pietro, rispondo a ognuna o prendi un...
Thank you very much. Do I answer each single question? Well, I don't know if there are any other questions. I believe we can start answering with this one because it's quite a demanding question. Exactly. So first of all, thank you very much for your question. And now we'll switch between the English and the Italian. I apologize for my bad Italian. So first of all, as a person born in Italy who has always lived abroad, it is very interesting to see how relevant this question is for Italy. Italy, much more than the United States, much more than the UK, has this idea of the state that cannot do so. The market will lead the economy and will define also the type of relationship we can have between the public and the private, as well as the incentives and subsidies which are widely used in Italy. And now I would like to shift to English because I'm getting a little bit confused.
About trickle-down economics is that it actually is everywhere. It's not just, the Reagan and the Thatcher years. Anytime government focuses too much on tax incentives for business, it is trickle-down economics. The idea is make it easier for business to do something, it will do it, and then the benefits will spill over, will trickle down to the citizens. Unfortunately, what we know, and we've actually studied this in at least around certain types of tax incentives alone simply increase profits. They don't increase investment. What many countries like in Italy suffer from is lack of business investment. My good friend Luciano Coutinho in Brazil, who was the head of the public bank in Brazil, like GDP in Italy, in Brazil it's BNDES, he used to say, Brazil is capitalism without capitalists. So in Italy, unfortunately, there's many good companies. I know that, I know many of the leaders of Luxottica and elsewhere, but unfortunately, if you look at the data, there's not enough business investment. So how do you increase business investment? Do you just make it easier for business to invest by making it cheaper in particular areas, by reducing the taxes, by reducing the costs even of things like research and development? Or do you help lead the way? Do you make direct investments in particular areas, including a greener economy, which then increases the expectations in the business community of where future opportunities lie, okay? And this is what I think government should be doing. It should be making the difficult investments, the capital intensive, high risk ones in broadly defined areas, not little projects, broadly defined areas, hence these kind of missions, which set a whole kind of new landscape, create a market, which then business gets, in economics, we would say crowded in, catalyzed to enter. And if you only focus on trickle-down economics and different types of tax policies and tax incentives, you don't achieve that. So what gets hurt is innovation. What gets hurt is investment. And what you increase is inequality. And the best person to read this on is Warren Buffett. He's not a communist. He's not a socialist. He's, I think, the richest man in the world, at least one of. And he has often said, stop reducing my tax. Stop reducing my capital gains tax. Stop reducing my corporate income tax. I don't even look at it. I look where I see an opportunity. So a lot of what I've been talking about is how do we get smart policy, not stupid policy, to increase the expectations in the business community of where those opportunities lie. And I look at specific countries like Denmark, not just big countries like the US or China. Denmark today, it's a tiny country, is the #1 provider of high-tech, green, digital services to China. China is spending over 2 trillion, what is that, mille miliardi, so 12 zeros, paperino, paperone, so, $2 trillion to green its economy through every sector. And Denmark is servicing the digital part of that. And if you look at how it achieved that, it actually was through really bold missions at the city level, like in Copenhagen, where the startup community was helped to actually serve some real important missions that the government had in terms of carbon neutrality, and they scaled up their capacity precisely through these ambitious policies. And then Denmark benefits from that startup and scaling up process when you have a country like China requiring those services. But if you look at how they did that, it was not through trickle-down economics. And so just the last point I would say is in Italy, I think what we need to do is learn what worked in the past, what is not working now, what did not work in the past. So if you look at EDI, a big state-owned enterprise in Italy, we shouldn't look at it like a big blob. We should break it down into its history. And I see three important phases in its history. The first was public but not politicized. And it had all sorts of the top managers wanted to work in EDI. It was a place, it was honorable to work there. And they basically achieved very difficult things, like the Autostrada del Sole built, I think, in just 4 years or something. Whereas anyone who lives in Milan or Torino know how long that Autostrada recently has taken to make. Anyway, the second phase was public and super politicized. And the third phase was privatized. So the second phase and the third phase were equally disastrous. Just like the privatization of Telecom Italia was disastrous in terms of the cuts in the R&D budget that came as part of that. So it's not private or public, it's how you govern the private sector to be more purpose-oriented and the public sector to be public but not politicized. And already in the entrepreneurial state, Lo Stato Innovatore, and in this book, I look at specific public organizations. What does it mean to be public but not politicized? So, you know, DARPA brings in top people for 5 years to be civil servants. They're very explicit. They want them to take risks, big bets around big public problems. They are rewarded for taking risk. Most civil servants are penalized for making mistakes. You're on the front page in the UK of the Daily Mail. Luckily in Italy, we don't have the Daily Mail. Anyway, if you make a mistake. So that recognition, you have to experiment and learning by doing to solve big problems. It's these lessons we need to learn and ask, what would it look like in RAI? What would it look like inside the Ministry of Health? What would it look like to have a public sector which is purpose-oriented, public value-oriented, welcomed experimentation, as opposed to the old ideology of state versus business?
Anna, we have time for another question. Meanwhile, I would like to make a comment. So this idea about purpose orientation, this should apply to all of us, because that should really drive also our life. And this could have implications also for our private lives. So if there are no questions, I think that we can stop. Many thanks, Mariana Mazzucato. And once again, I'm showing you the book. I recommend this book. It's accessible to everyone. You don't need to be a professor in order to read it. Thank you. Thank you, Mariana.